What happened to those lost African American recipes that shaped America but were forgotten? These recipes fed families, built traditions, and carried a culture's strength into kitchens across the country. How could something so central to daily life be allowed to fade from memory? Ashcake cornbread was one of the most remarkable examples of survival food created under the harshest conditions. Enslaved people with little access to ovens or luxury cookware made use of the ashes from their cooking fires to bake simple cornmeal batter into dense, smoky cakes. The mixture was made with nothing more than ground cornmeal, a pinch of salt, and just enough water to form a dough, sometimes mixed with lard if it was available. The dough was wrapped in leaves or simply patted into rounds and placed directly into the warm ashes until it hardened and became edible. The taste was plain but filling, and the slight char from the ashes gave it a flavor that was far from unpleasant. Ash cakes were carried into the fields and eaten throughout the day, keeping bodies working under brutal conditions with minimal fuel. For generations, this simple bread represented both creativity and survival, showing how African Americans turned even fire ashes into sustenance. It was food that reminded people that survival did not require abundance, but only resourcefulness and determination, which is why the recipe deserves to be remembered even if it is rarely made today. Chitlin loaf was born out of necessity, a recipe designed to make the most of pig intestines, which were one of the few cuts left to enslaved communities after butchering. Chitterlings were thoroughly cleaned, boiled, chopped, and pressed into a loaf pan until they set firm enough to slice. When eaten cold, it resembled luncheon meat, but when fried, it took on a crisp, savory flavor that gave strength to people working long hours. It stretched resources in a way that turned scraps into something resembling a complete dish. The loaf could be seasoned with onion, pepper, and whatever herbs were on hand, making each version unique to the family that prepared it. For many households, chitlin loaf became a tradition that reached beyond slavery and into later generations who still valued the thrift and ingenuity it represented. Although it faded from mainstream tables, it left a mark as an example of transforming what others discarded into nourishment. The loaf told a story of resilience and pride, turning humble offal into a remembered part of African American food history that shaped diets across the South. Salad greens with potlikker were more than a meal. They were an act of preserving strength when little else was available. Enslaved families foraged wild greens like dandelion, mustard, or pokeweed and simmered them with pork scraps or smoked bones. The greens became tender and flavorful, but the real treasure was the broth left behind, known as potlikker. This dark, mineral-rich liquid contained vitamins and nutrients that were otherwise missing from diets starved of fresh food. Families would drink the broth straight or sop it up with bread, ensuring that nothing went to waste. In an age when survival meant using every possible resource, salad greens were a lifeline. They were cheap, nourishing, and deeply tied to the land, giving people the strength to endure daily hardship. Potlikker became a symbol of resourcefulness and wisdom, passed down through generations even after slavery ended. It represented not only thrift, but also the knowledge of how to pull health from the humblest ingredients. This dish is remembered with pride because it kept families alive with nothing more than leaves, scraps, and the determination to waste nothing. Hominy stew, often called lye hominy, was a dish that combined practicality with a deep connection to African and indigenous foodways. Dried corn kernels were soaked in a lye solution, which removed the hulls and made the grain more digestible and nutritious. Once rinsed and boiled, the hominy was cooked into stews thickened with beans, pork, or vegetables when available. It was filling, hearty, and carried families through long periods when flour and wheat-based breads were scarce. The process of making lye hominy was tedious but essential, requiring patience and skill to avoid bitterness or waste. This technique, carried from African traditions and blended with Native American practices, shows how cultural knowledge sustained enslaved communities. Hominy stew gave variety to diets otherwise restricted to scraps, offering warmth, fullness, and strength. The dish was a reminder that food was not just fuel but also resilience, created with methods that preserved life when options were few. It was food born from hardship yet tied to deep culinary traditions that continue to influence American cooking today. Hogmaw stew was a dish that made use of the pig's stomach, an organ often discarded but valued in African American kitchens for its versatility. The stomach was cleaned carefully, stuffed with vegetables, rice, or scraps of pork, and then simmered slowly until it became tender. This method transformed what was considered waste into a hearty, satisfying meal that could feed an entire family. The stew was seasoned with onions, peppers, and herbs, making it flavorful even with humble ingredients. It carried warmth during cold winters and stood as an example of making the most of what little was available. Hogmaw stew was a food of community and survival, prepared in large pots where everyone shared from the same source. It represented both frugality and tradition, showing how African American cooks transformed overlooked cuts into celebrated meals. Though it has faded from many kitchens, Hogmaw stew remains an important symbol of resourcefulness and determination. It shaped the way American cooking learned to embrace slow-simmered, rich flavors from unexpected places. Molasses bread carried workers through the hardest days, offering sweetness and energy when sugar was far too expensive to afford. Made from coarse flour or cornmeal and flavored only with molasses, this bread was dense, dark, and nourishing. The rich syrup gave the loaf both moisture and flavor, turning simple ingredients into something that felt indulgent despite its humble roots. Enslaved people and later poor communities relied on molasses as a sweetener because it was cheaper and easier to find than refined sugar. Baked into bread, it became a staple of lunches packed for long days in fields or factories. It paired well with butter, drippings, or even just a hot drink, stretching its usefulness far beyond dessert. The bread symbolized thrift and ingenuity, a reminder that even in scarcity, a touch of sweetness could be preserved. Families baked it often, making it both a comfort food and a source of strength. Over time, molasses bread faded from common kitchens, replaced by lighter loaves, but its history remains tied to endurance and creativity. Slippery dumplings were a dish that spoke of both comfort and practicality. Rolled thin and cut into strips, the dumplings were simmered directly in broth until they became soft and slick. Unlike fluffy biscuit-style dumplings, these were flat and hearty, stretching the meal further without requiring much meat. They turned simple pots of broth into full dinners that could feed entire households. Housewives and grandmothers passed the recipe down, each one adding small touches to make the dish uniquely their own. The dumplings absorbed flavor from pork bones, chicken scraps, or smoked meats, making every bite rich and satisfying. They were filling, inexpensive, and easy to prepare, which made them staples of frugal kitchens across African American communities. Families gathered around steaming bowls, grateful for the warmth and nourishment provided by flour, water, and a little salt. Slippery dumplings represented the kind of food that turned scarcity into abundance, transforming simple broth into a feast. Though often forgotten today, they shaped how comfort food was defined and remembered. Souse, or pickled pork parts, was one of the thriftiest dishes to come from African American kitchens, making use of pig's feet, ears, and snouts. These cuts were cleaned, boiled, and then preserved in vinegar, onions, and spices until they took on a tangy flavor. Once cooled, the meat set into a gelatin-like texture that could be sliced and eaten cold. It was high in protein, cheap to prepare, and kept well, which made it a practical food for households with limited access to refrigeration. Souse was eaten with bread, crackers, or on its own, giving families a way to stretch meager supplies into days of meals. It was a dish of necessity but also of ingenuity, turning unwanted parts into something flavorful and sustaining. For many, it became a cultural staple remembered for its bold taste and practicality. Though it has slipped from most tables today, Souse reflects the resilience of African American cooking traditions that turned thrift into heritage. Cowpea fritters were among the earliest African-rooted street foods in America, created by enslaved people who mashed black-eyed peas into batter and fried them into golden patties. These fritters were crispy on the outside, soft on the inside and seasoned with onions, peppers, and spices. They were portable, filling, and inexpensive, making them perfect for long days of work or for selling at markets. The recipe carried deep African influences, as black-eyed peas were a staple ingredient brought across the Atlantic. In America, they became symbols of both survival and tradition, eaten especially during celebrations or gatherings. Cowpea fritters were also among the first foods to show how African American cooking shaped public food culture, with versions eventually inspiring later dishes sold in cities. They represented thrift, creativity, and cultural pride, turning simple legumes into something beloved and sustaining. Though rarely seen now, cowpea fritters are part of the forgotten foundation of American street food history. Hoghead cheese was a dish that wasted nothing and demanded patience. A whole pig's head was simmered until the meat, skin, and connective tissue softened and released natural gelatin. The pieces were chopped, seasoned with vinegar, peppers, and spices, then packed into a mold and cooled until it set into a tureen. Despite its name, no dairy was involved, but the result was a sliceable loaf of tender meat bound in savory jelly. It was eaten cold, served with bread or crackers, and provided both protein and calories at a time when nothing could be spared. Hoghead cheese was a dish of survival, but it also became a point of cultural identity in many African American communities, particularly in the South. Its preparation required skill and care, and its taste carried both boldness and nostalgia. Over time, it faded from most American tables, but it shaped how entire communities learned to value every part of the animal. It remains a reminder of thrift, heritage, and ingenuity. Peanut soup was one of the earliest African-inspired recipes to take root in American kitchens, especially across Virginia, where enslaved cooks blended ground peanuts into broths to create a creamy filling dish. The peanuts provided both protein and richness, making it valuable in times when meat was scarce or expensive. Families found comfort in its nutty flavor, often stretching a handful of peanuts into a meal that fed many mouths. Seasoned with onions, garlic, or peppers when available, peanut soup was adaptable to whatever was at hand, and it always carried a sense of warmth. Over generations, it became a Sunday staple in some households, while in others it was the food of special gatherings. Though its African origins were often overlooked, its place in American foodways proved the quiet strength of culinary memory. Even when later overshadowed by other soups, peanut soup never lost its identity as a bridge between two continents. Its presence in kitchens told the story of resilience and cultural pride, showing how something humble could become beloved and sustaining. Today, it remains a hidden gem of history, remembered as one of the dishes that truly shaped Southern tables. Red horse bread was a thrifty invention that came alive along Southern riversides where fishermen fried cornmeal cakes in leftover fish grease. The name came from red horsefish, a common catch, but the bread itself became known for its smoky, savory flavor rather than its source. Cornmeal, water, and a bit of salt were pressed into patties, then fried in the sizzling grease until crisp. The result was both hearty and resourceful, turning scraps into nourishment that could feed hungry workers on long days by the river. It became a common food at fish fries, where families gathered to share meals, and it carried a taste that was hard to forget. The richness of the grease flavored the cornmeal in a way that butter never could, adding depth to something so simple. Red horse bread was practical, quick, and tied to community gatherings, becoming a remembered part of African American river culture. Though it rarely appears today, it shaped how resourcefulness and tradition mingled in kitchens that valued every drop of flavor. Its story is one of turning necessity into custom and custom into memory that lasted well beyond the riversides. Kush, sometimes called Civil War hash, was a humble yet sustaining dish born of scarcity and survival. Cornmeal was browned in pork fat, then combined with scraps of fried meat to create a filling, hash-like mixture. Soldiers relied on it during the war, but its roots traced back to enslaved cooks who made do with what little was given to them. It was cheap, portable, and nourishing, everything a working body required. Kush was not glamorous, but it provided comfort to those who ate it, warming bellies when little else was available. Seasonings were sparse, usually limited to salt or pepper, but the smoky flavor from the pork scraps gave it life. Families would prepare it as a breakfast or supper, stretching their rations with ingenuity. In every way, it reflected the frugal, adaptive spirit of African American kitchens. Even when history shifted and the war ended, Kush carried on in memory, though it gradually slipped out of daily meals. It was food that spoke of hardship, endurance, and the power of turning crumbs into sustenance. Its place in culinary history reminds us of the ingenuity that carried people through the hardest of times. Pokeweed greens were the definition of survival food, foraged in early spring when pantries were bare after long winters. The plant itself was poisonous unless handled with care, requiring boiling and draining at least twice before it could be eaten safely. Despite this danger, it was treasured as one of the first fresh greens available after months of dried staples. For African American families who relied on ingenuity, Pokeweed became a seasonal ritual, reminding them that food could still be gathered even when money was scarce. Once properly cooked, the greens had a strong, earthy flavor that paired well with cornbread or pork drippings. They were eaten for their nutrition as much as their taste, offering vitamins that bodies craved after lean months. Foraging pokeweed also represented the knowledge passed down across generations, an understanding of the land that went beyond mere cooking. It was never glamorous, but it was always necessary, and that alone made it beloved. Pokeweed greens stand as a testament to resilience, showing how families turned even risky plants into nourishment that kept them alive and tied them to the rhythms of nature itself. Giblet gravy over rice was a dish that proved every part of a chicken had value and nothing could be wasted. The giblets, often discarded by wealthier households, were simmered with onions, seasonings, and broth until tender. When poured over a bed of rice, the mixture became a rich, satisfying meal that carried families through many nights. It was cheap to make, since giblets were often sold for little or simply included with whole chickens, and rice stretched it into a dish that filled bellies. For African American households, it represented ingenuity and respect for food, a refusal to discard what could still provide nourishment. The gravy was flavorful, hearty, and comforting, reminding families that meals did not need expensive cuts to feel indulgent. It became a tradition at many tables, where the sauce transformed plain rice into something savory and memorable. For children growing up, the smell of giblet gravy often meant home and warmth. Even though it has faded from popularity today, it was once a cornerstone of thrifty, creative cooking. Its legacy endures as proof that frugality and flavor could walk hand in hand in kitchens shaped by necessity. Hopping John variants told a story of celebration, adaptation, and survival all at once. The earliest versions were simple, mixing field peas and rice without any meat at all, reflecting what enslaved people had available. Later, when scraps of pork became more accessible, the dish took on new life as a celebratory food for holidays like New Year's Day. The peas symbolized coins and prosperity, while the rice carried tradition from both African and Southern roots. It was thrifty and symbolic, feeding large families with minimal cost. Each household had its own spin, adding greens, onions, or spices to stretch the dish further. For many, Hopping John was not just a meal, but a ritual, carrying hope for abundance in the coming year. The variants proved how flexible and resilient the recipe could be, shaped by whatever ingredients were at hand. Its endurance across generations speaks to its deep cultural roots, and yet many of its earliest, simplest forms have been forgotten. Hopping John stood as both food and folklore, showing how sustenance could carry dreams of a better tomorrow. It is a dish remembered with pride and longing for its cultural weight. Sweet potato coffee was one of the cleverest substitutions created during hard times when coffee beans were simply unaffordable. Housewives would roast slices of sweet potato until they were dark and brittle, then grind them into a coarse powder that resembled coffee grounds. When steeped in hot water, the drink carried a roasted, earthy flavor that gave the illusion of coffee without the expense. While it lacked caffeine, it provided warmth and ritual. both of which were valuable in households struggling to make ends meet. Sweet potatoes were abundant, inexpensive, and easy to store, making them the perfect stand-in. The drink became a morning staple for many families, a symbol of thrift and determination to preserve comfort despite hardship. It reminded people that pleasure could still be created from the simplest of crops. Though it faded from tables when coffee became widely available again, its memory speaks volumes about creativity under pressure. Sweet potato coffee may not have been perfect, but it was comforting, resourceful, and deeply tied to the survival spirit of African American communities across generations. Okra stew with tomatoes was one of the most nourishing dishes in African American kitchens, long before canned gumbo appeared on shelves. Brought from African food traditions, okra thickened the broth naturally, creating a stew that was hearty, filling, and full of nutrition. Tomatoes added brightness and tang, making the dish balanced and lively, while bread or rice often stretched it into full meals. Families leaned on it during lean times, since okra thrived in southern gardens, and tomatoes could be easily canned or dried for year-round use. It welcomed scraps of meat or vegetables when available, but was satisfying even without additions, proving its adaptability. The stew was more than food. It carried cultural memory, linking kitchens back to African roots while embracing American soil. For children, it became the taste of home, reliable no matter the hardships. Okra stew deserves remembrance as a cultural staple that shaped survival. Kushaw squash pie was a forgotten dessert that came before pumpkin pies became the national favorite. The green-striped Kushaw squash was plentiful, sweet, and more reliable than pumpkin in certain regions, making it the natural choice for baking. Cooks roasted the flesh, mashed it smooth, and blended it with eggs, milk, sugar, and spices to create a custard-like filling poured into simple crusts. The result was a golden pie enjoyed at holidays and gatherings, often celebrated for its thrift and flavor. Its taste was gentler than pumpkin, but still spiced and warm, perfect for celebrations when resources were limited. The Kushaw stored well through the winter, so it provided sweetness long after harvest. Over time, canned pumpkin overtook it, pushing Kushaw pie from the spotlight. Yet it once held an important place on family tables, carrying memory, pride, and resourcefulness. Remembering it restores a forgotten piece of African American kitchen heritage. Cracklin bread was a hearty dish that transformed ordinary cornbread into a filling staple by folding in pork cracklings. Housewives mixed crispy bits of pork skin and fat into cornmeal batter before baking it until golden, creating a loaf that was crunchy, savory, and rich. It was strong enough to stand alone as a meal, yet was often paired with beans, greens, or stews to complete the table. This bread reflected a farm kitchen ethic of wasting nothing, as every part of the hog was valued and used with care. For African American families, it became a food of comfort and creativity, born from thrift but remembered for flavor. Shared at suppers and community gatherings, it carried warmth and connection, with each slice telling a story of resilience. Though it is rarely baked today, Cracklin bread once stood as proof that scraps could become treasures, shaping Southern tables with pride. Fish roe croquettes were an example of turning what many considered waste into something comforting and sustaining. Along coastal communities, fish eggs were not discarded but gathered, seasoned, and mixed with breadcrumbs or cornmeal to form small patties. These were fried until crisp on the outside and soft within, giving a flavor that was rich, briny, and unlike anything else. Families relied on dishes like this when money was scarce, and fish roe was often given away cheaply or simply collected by hand. Croquettes stretched the catch further, allowing even the poorest households to enjoy something filling that also carried a sense of luxury. Children might not have known they were eating fish eggs, only that the croquettes were tasty and satisfying. It was a clever way of ensuring that nothing went unused, and for many families it became a treasured recipe passed quietly down generations. While modern tables rarely see fish roe croquettes, their history remains tied to ingenuity, thrift, and the ability to turn necessity into a dish of pride. Hog crackling popcorn mix was a rural snack that combined the love of pork with the tradition of corn. Corn kernels were popped in rendered hog fat, giving them a smoky richness that butter could never replicate. To make it even heartier, salty bits of pork cracklings were stirred through the mix, creating a snack that was both crunchy and savory. Families gathered around bowls of it in the evenings, sharing handfuls while telling stories or winding down from long days of work. It was inexpensive, easy to prepare, and used ingredients that most households already had on hand. Cracklings themselves were a byproduct of hog butchering, so they carried no extra cost, making this treat especially appealing. It was food that celebrated thrift, but it was also undeniably enjoyable, filling the house with smells that brought comfort. Hog crackling popcorn mix deserves to be remembered as one of the cleverest country snacks, born of making the most out of every part of the harvest. Molasses water, often called sweet water, was one of the simplest and most refreshing drinks for families with little money to spare. All it took was a spoonful of blackstrap molasses stirred into cool well water, creating a dark, sweetened drink that replaced costly store-bought sodas. Children found it a treat, while adults drank it to quench thirst and restore energy after long hours of work. Molasses provided iron and nutrients missing from diets, so sweet water was more than just a sweet sip, it was practical nourishment. For rural households, it was also a ritual, something mixed quickly and served in tin cups on hot days. The taste was distinct, earthy, and slightly bitter, but to those who grew up on it, sweet water was as satisfying as any bottled drink. It carried with it the memory of hard times when small luxuries were created out of what was at hand. Though forgotten now, molasses water was once a lifeline of refreshment in homes where resourcefulness shaped every choice. Field pea soup was a sustaining dish that appeared often in plantation kitchens and later in farm households across the South. Made from hearty cowpeas simmered with ham bones or pork scraps, it created a rich broth that was both filling and affordable. Cowpeas were easy to grow in tough soil, and they provided protein that carried families through difficult seasons. The soup itself was simple but hearty, and it stretched small amounts of meat to feed many mouths. A pot of field pea soup could simmer all day, feeding workers who needed strength while keeping costs to a minimum. The flavor was earthy, smoky, and deeply tied to Southern identity, carrying traces of African food traditions into American kitchens. Families served it with cornbread, which soaked up the broth and made the meal complete. Field pea soup was not only frugal but also comforting, a reminder that humble ingredients could create dishes worth remembering. Though often overshadowed by other beans and soups, it remains an important piece of African American food history and a symbol of resilience and thrift. Dandelion root coffee was a clever stand-in for real coffee when families could not afford imported beans. Roots were dug from fields, scrubbed clean, roasted until dark, then ground and brewed like traditional coffee. The drink was bitter, earthy, and aromatic, providing the ritual of coffee without the expense. It carried traces of African and native herbal traditions where plants were used for both sustenance and healing. While it offered no caffeine, it still brought comfort, warmth, and a sense of normalcy to mornings. During wartime shortages, when substitutes were a necessity, this drink became even more common in kitchens that needed alternatives. It was not simply about flavor, but about survival, proving families could create something out of weeds that grew freely. For those who drank it, dandelion root coffee was a symbol of resilience, turning scarcity into familiarity and making hardship feel just a little easier to endure. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes were one of the most straightforward yet comforting foods for communities with little to spare. Whole sweet potatoes were buried under hot embers and left to cook slowly until their skins blackened and their centers grew soft and caramel sweet. They needed no pans or ovens, just fire and patience, making them a practical food for enslaved people and poor farmers alike. Many ate them plain with a pinch of salt, while others drizzled molasses for extra richness. Sweet potatoes stored well through winter months, making them a dependable staple when gardens were bare. Pulling one from the ashes and eating it steaming hot was a memory tied to both nourishment and comfort. It was a small joy that brightened otherwise difficult days. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes were humble, thrifty, and deeply satisfying. a forgotten recipe that once stood as proof of resilience and resourceful living. Catfish stew with milk was a riverside dish that made the most of local abundance, combining fresh fish with onions, peppers, and milk into a creamy, peppery broth. The milk stretched small amounts of fish into larger meals, while cornbread was served on the side to soak up every drop. It became a symbol of resourcefulness, transforming a modest catch into a hearty dinner for entire families. The stew carried flavors that spoke of rivers, gardens, and hearths, offering comfort and strength after long hours of labor. It was affordable, practical, and memorable, keeping bodies full without luxury ingredients. Though rarely remembered today, catfish stew with milk reflects how African American cooks blended creativity with necessity, turning river life into enduring food traditions. Batterbread was a thin, pourable cornbread that provided a thrifty alternative when resources were too limited for elaborate loaves. Made from cornmeal, milk, water, and sometimes eggs, it baked quickly in a skillet, crisp at the edges and soft inside. Families valued it for being easy, fast, and economical, requiring less fuel and fewer ingredients than standard breads. It was versatile enough for breakfasts or suppers, paired with stews, greens, or beans to add substance to the table. Batterbread was so simple that even children could help prepare it, making it a household favorite. Its speed and practicality made it ideal for families balancing hard labor with limited time. While it has mostly faded into obscurity, Batterbread once sustained countless homes, proving that the most modest recipes could provide nourishment and comfort during lean times. Turnip green chow chow was a bright, tangy relish that transformed scraps into something vibrant and useful. Made from chopped turnip greens, cabbage, onions, peppers, and green tomatoes, it was pickled with vinegar and spices to create a sharp, colorful condiment. Families prepared it in bulk during harvest to preserve vegetables that would otherwise spoil, storing jars for winter months. It was thrifty, practical, and flavorful, cutting through the heaviness of beans, rice, and cornbread. Beyond the kitchen, it also carried community value, as jars were shared or traded among neighbors, spreading both food and goodwill. Chow chow proved that African American cooks could elevate scraps into something memorable, giving plain meals zest and variety. Its sharpness made every plate more satisfying, and its presence in kitchens spoke of both thrift and ingenuity. Though today it lingers only in a few traditions, it represents the enduring creativity of cooks who refuse to waste anything. Blackstrap molasses gingerbread turned one of the cheapest sweeteners into a festive cake rich with spice and memory. Molasses, heavy and inexpensive, was mixed with flour, ginger, cinnamon, and sometimes lard to create a dense, chewy dessert. Families baked it in cast-iron skillets, filling kitchens with warming aromas even in times of hardship. Children remembered it as a sweet treat at holidays or Sunday gatherings, while adults valued it as fuel for long days of work. It symbolized both thrift and celebration, showing how something humble could feel indulgent. The cake was simple, yet deeply comforting, eaten plain or occasionally topped with whipped cream if fortune allowed. It offered a rare taste of joy when resources were few, proving that flavor could come from the humblest ingredients. Though largely forgotten today, blackstrap molasses gingerbread once embodied endurance and creativity, making every bite a small victory over scarcity. Tell us which lost recipe you'd revive, tap like if it sparked a memory, and subscribe for more forgotten